Afternoon, Dr. Hilary Aitken. Most of you will know Hilary, but for those who don't, I'll give you a little bit of a background of her life. Hilary is a retired consultant anaesthetist. I had to practice that last time, I didn't do very well. Slightly better this time, slightly clearer. She's from the west of Scotland. She's a life member of the Jane Austen Society and joined the Scottish branch in 2004, soon after its formation. She joined the committee in 2018, where she took on many different roles, including chairperson. She was a valued member of the committee, showing enthusiasm and offering many useful ideas. She continues to be a supportive member of our branch, attending meetings regularly, offering help at events, giving votes of thanks, setting tables, serving teas, washing dishes, and running our bookstall. A very active and enthusiastic lady. But since retiring, Hilary has some new activities. She now helps in an Oxfam shop selling specialist vinyl records. Very specialist job, I understand. And she says it's a good job for her because she's had experience in the past, because in 1976, she worked in Woolworths doing the very same thing, selling vinyl records.
It's the same records as well.
She's also in a choir in Pollock Shields, which she's been a member of for some time, and she really enjoys her music. Hilary has given several interesting talks to the branch in the past, in person and also on Zoom. And I'm sure today's talk, Mothers in Jane Austen, will be equally enjoyable. So please welcome Dr. Hilary Aitken.
Thank you, Andrina, for that introduction. And we have a number of people on Zoom today, so I'd like to say particularly hello Zoom people. You haven't had the nice lunch that we've just had, that's all. So a couple of weeks ago, I was blamelessly enjoying a sunny Easter Sunday afternoon. We did have a sunny Easter Sunday afternoon in the west of Scotland, and I received an email from Marlene with this heading, and that's never good, is it? Unfortunately, our planned speaker for today, David Macleay, has had to withdraw for health reasons, and I'm sure many of you were there a few years ago. The branch had a great visit to see the Murray Archive at the National Library of Scotland. And David was its curator, and he was a very knowledgeable and generous host. We all got to handle actual Jane Austen letters and manuscripts, and so I'm sure we all wish him well. And on the plus side, it made a good speaker on the back burner for some future date when he's restored to health. And I'm your super sub for today. This is a repeat. I first gave this talk in 2016, so if the BBC can do it, the Jane Austen Society Scottish branch can do it. I'm hoping that a number of you haven't heard it, and I'm hoping those of you that have heard it have forgotten it. However, if you have heard it and you haven't forgotten it, now you can have a little snooze for a wee while, and we'll wake you up when tea's about to be served. I've been interested in the mothers in the novels of Jane Austen for some time, and some of her most memorable characters are the mothers, aren't they? The interesting thing, though, is there's not many good ones. The nearest Jane Austen gets to the traditional saintly mother, beloved, particularly Victorian novels, is Lady Elliot in Persuasion, and she's actually been dead for 13 years. So who's getting which Mother's Day card here? This is a more traditional one. This is the one, to be honest, I'm more likely to say my mum, to be honest. It's an interesting message on that one, so we can decide at the end who's having which one. In summary, what I'm going to do today is tell you what I did. How did I put this talk together? I was, as Andrina has mentioned, I was a doctor, so I've written and delivered lots of scientific talks, and we're very big in methodology. So methodology is a very big word for what I did. Some general observations that I made on the way through were less keen on that in medical. You can't just say, oh, this thing struck me, that was quite a good thing. You need to have a bit of evidence, but general observations are fine in the Jane Austen talk. I then thought we could think a little bit about the mothers, the roles a mother would be expected to play in Jane Austen's world. And I use the word world advisedly, not Jane Austen's time, because if you were the mother of a girl that was going to become a parlour maid or was going to help out on the family farm, most of these rules would not be applicable. Jane Austen, as we know, looked at a very narrow stratum of society. It's one of the criticisms levelled at her that we won't hear of. But this is very much the mothers that we find in Jane Austen we're going to be looking at. The subtitle talks the good, the bad, and the really terrible, so we'll have a look at some of them. And then at the very end, those of you that are having a snooze will need to waken up a wee bit before tea, because we're going to have a vote and decide who's the best mother and who's the worst mother in Jane Austen by our views. Any of you will remember that David Richardson gives an interesting talk on the fathers in Jane Austen over Zoom when we were all sitting in our various dining rooms, zooming away. Everybody had nice artwork on the walls and things like that. Cats would intervene. We don't get that here, really, do we? So, in a spirit of equality between the sexes, I thought it was time maybe to have another look at the mothers. I seem to remember the fathers didn't come out of David's talk awfully well, but I'm afraid the mothers might be even worse. So, Jane Austen really doesn't have a good view of parents in general. I confined myself to the 6 major novels, thereby missing out Lady Susan, who would be a strong candidate in the worst mother category. So what I actually did was reread the 6 novels, focusing purely on who the mothers are, what they do, and what they say. I'm a terrible skim reader. I don't know if I'm alone in that. We're all a room full of literary ladies and gents, so maybe it's just me. But moving my focus away from the heroines and the main characters and the main thrust of the plot allowed me to have an interesting slant in the novels, looking at it very much this aspect of just the mothers. None of the heroines are or become mothers during the course of the books, but since they all get married, I think we can assume that some, if not most of them, will become mothers. What sort of mothers the heroines might make is another talk altogether. Can anyone imagine being Emma's daughter? I changed my opinions on some of the characters in a way that surprised me, and spotted a number of those gorgeous little character studies that Jane Austen does so well. She conjures up whole personalities in just a few paragraphs. And I discovered one character who I didn't even know was a mother. So if you start with the heroines' mothers, they're not a very inspiring lot, are they? So Sense and Sensibility, Mrs. Dashwood, delightful but an utterly useless mother, and we'll talk about that in a wee while. Pride and Prejudice, don't even know what to say, to be honest. Mansfield Park, Fanny's mother is absent and a slattern, and we'll find out later who called her that. Emma's mother's dead. Northanger Abbey, Mrs. Morland, I think, is probably the best of the lot, but she's a wee bit hands-off, isn't she? And in Persuasion, Anne's mother is dead. In all, I identified 34 mothers, some of whom are dead, plus many others who get a wee mention just in passing. So there's Mrs. Smallridge, she's Mrs. Elton's friend in need of a governess in Emma, and all the hopeful mothers of daughters who are acquainted with Henry Crawford and Tom Bertram in Mansfield Park. But the ration of significant mothers in the different books is very variable. There's only 2 who get more than a mention in Emma. There's Emma's sister, Isabella, and Mrs. Bates, and neither of those are major characters. Emma's actually striking for the number of dead mothers and the young adults who grew up without a mother. Emma and Isabella, obviously their mother's dead. Frank Churchill's mother, the first Mrs. Weston, is dead. Jane Fairfax's mother's dead. Harriet Smith's mother might be alive, but she's certainly not around. And Augusta Hawkins, who subsequently becomes Elton, her mother is dead. In contrast, Sense and Sensibility contains lots of mothers, and as a group, they're probably the most interesting. One of the things that struck me is in Sense and Sensibility, there are pairs of mothers and daughters. Every mother of adult children has got a daughter who's just like her. So here's the pairs, Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne. They're 2 peas out of the same pod, aren't they? Mrs. Jennings and Charlotte Palmer, they both like a bit of a chat, bless them. Mrs. Ferrars and Fanny Dashwood, less happily. And of course, there's the 2 Elizas, the fallen women, Eliza Brandon and Eliza Williams. The first 2, of course, have children who are very unlike them as well, but that's families, isn't it? So I thought we might have a look at the roles we might expect of the mother in Jane Austen's world and her stratum of society. The mother would be responsible for educating her children. She'd be responsible not only for running the household, but showing her daughters how it was done. She would be responsible for nursing. That's why Mother talks, a bit of an advert for the next time a speaker drops out, you might get that one. She would be responsible for protecting her children in various ways. As mothers today, you eventually have to allow your children a degree of independence. There's lots of chat, isn't there? We all used to run down to the shops and get the bus to school when we were 5. Nowadays, you can get until you're 2. So independence and marriage, last but very much not least. And we're going to take a look at these in a bit more detail, and we'll see the way some of the mothers perform or perhaps fail to perform these roles in the novels. Education covers a number of areas. There's scholastic education, what you think of as education. Accomplishments, those of us who love Jane Austen know all about accomplishments. Whether we have any or not is another matter. The way you conduct yourself, I think that's still quite important, but very important in Jane Austen, and life skills. Education of girls, of children, especially the girls, may to fall to the mother. The boys, when older, would often go to school, but as we see in the novels, the girls tended to remain at home with the family. There were some schools for girls. Jane Austen herself briefly attended school, and Anne Elliot was sent to school in Bath after her mother died. And in Emma, we have Mrs. Goddard's school, a real old-fashioned school where a reasonable quantity of accomplishments were sold at a reasonable price, and where girls may be sent to be out of the way and scramble themselves into a little education without any danger of coming back prodigies. It's hardly St. Paul's school for girls, is it? Wealthier families might have a governess. Wealthier families might have a governess. So Emma and Isabel have had Miss Taylor, and Miss Lee was in charge of educating the Mansfield girls. The boys went to Eton and Mansfield, a little bit of educational disparity there. And as we see in Emma, when Mrs. Elton is trying to organise Jane Fairfax, appointing the governess seemed to be very much the remit of the house. We read about Mrs. Morland in Northanger Abbey educating 10 children, mainly herself, with some assistance from her husband and tutors. She herself is obviously well educated. She teaches her children recitation and French, an interesting subject in 18th century England. When you think about it, we were at war with France during all that time. But French was very much viewed as an accomplishment. If you could speak French, you were a bit posh and classy. Mrs. Morland takes her time over it because Catherine is very slow to learn. So we hear about Mrs. Morland helping Catherine along, dragging her, kicking, screaming through her French verbs. In contrast, Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice is not an educator. Elizabeth says at one point, those who chose to be idle certainly might. Mrs. Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility talks about the advantage of her elder daughters going to visit in London, as she and Margaret, the youngest daughter, shall go on so quietly and happily together with our books and music. So clearly there's going to be a bit of studying going on when the older girls are out the way. Extensive reading is an admirable thing. So Anne Elliot is a reader, and Emma, full of good intentions as always, is forever making up reading lists, although getting around to doing the reading, bit of a different matter altogether. An important life skill for girls was accomplishments, mainly aimed at preparation for the marriage market. We hear Mr. Darcy's list, a rather extensive list of desirable skills, which nobody can measure up to, but most of the young ladies in the novels have some sort of skill. Jane Fairfax, Marianne Dashwood, and Anne Elliot all play the piano well, and Louisa and Henrietta Musgrove and Mary Crawford have harps. Eleanor Dashwood and Emma Woodhouse paint. I think all of them dance. Does anybody not dance? I think most of them dance anyway. And interestingly, none of the mothers are ever seen to play or sing themselves. And Mrs. Elton boasts of having quite given up music, having achieved her aim of finding a husband, as has Lady Middleton. However, even if they don't play themselves, most of the mothers make sure their daughters are versed in these sort of skills. So here we have a bit of needlework going on here. I don't quite know what's going on. But if you remember, Lady Bertram's always got some sort of needlework on the go. So that's some accomplishment for a young lady. Presumably practical skills. You hear about Fanny helping make her brother's shirts, don't we, for going off to the Navy. So here's some needlework going on. This is an illustration from Mansfield Park. That's Mary. She's playing her harp. Edmund's looking on. But Mary's missing a trick here, which is not like Mary, because playing the harp was designed to show off your lovely arms. And look at her long sleeves that she's got on. So, Mary, get a grip, love. Outside tutors for this sort of activity seem to be the norm, and they're mentioned in several of the novels. Tutors are brought in to teach this and that. In Northanger Abbey, the day which dismissed the music master was one of the happiest of Catherine's life. So Mrs. Morland didn't insist on her daughters being accomplished if they had no taste for it. Education in manners and conduct was also an important role for the mothers of daughters. We read about Mrs. Bennet failing to reprimand Lydia when she's been rather forward, or actually just plain rude, to Mr. Bingley about his plans for the ball. And later, she doesn't take her to task about the disgrace of her elopement. The estimable Mrs. Morland deals with her daughter on her return from Northanger Abbey, making it clear that prolonged moping about is not acceptable. In contrast, in Mansfield Park, Fanny Price's mother has children running riot and constant squabbles breaking out between ill-mannered children. Another responsibility of the mother, and a skill that their daughters would learn from them, was the art of running a household. Dealing with servants could be done well or badly, and we see both in different novels. Fanny's mother, Mrs. Price, can't manage her servants either, and the house is in constant uproar. Whereas Longbourn runs well with loyal servants under Mrs. Bennet's direction. And Mrs. Dashwood has 3 servants who seem to be very happy to transfer with the family to Devon and much less grand surroundings. However, a wee house in Devon with Mrs. Dashwood, or a big house in, I don't know where they were, with Fanny is not a good choice, is it really? The relationship with Cook would be particularly important. Mrs. Bennet and also Lady Middleton in Sense and Sensibility pride themselves on their kitchens. And Mrs. Bennet is offended that Mr. Collins should think that the daughters cook themselves. Mrs. Norris always seems to be muttering about the catering arrangements of her successor to the Mansfield parsonage, Mrs. Grant, and the clear implications that she's a poor home economist. She's probably just not as stingy as Mrs. Norris. Another role for mothers was sensible nursing, the far fewer medical options, and as we see with Marianne Dashwood, even a slight chill can become life-threatening. Some others had to have a degree of knowledge and sense, as they still do, to manage illness. We see Mrs. Jennings in Sense and Sensibility, the sensible granny, advising the nervous new mother, Charlotte, about the baby's red gum, but Charlotte calls the apothecary in. Mrs. Jennings also carries salts for reviving young ladies. In contrast, we have Mary Musgrove in Persuasion, who has hysterics when her son has a fall. Oh my goodness, that's Mary Musgrove having hysterics. I arranged for sound effects to be done today. So Mary Musgrove hands over the nursing to Anne, who's not a mother, but is much more capable. Isabel Knightley, Emma's sister, shares her father's hypochondria, but she has it on behalf of her children and sets as much store by the advice of Mr. Wingfield as her father does in Mr. Perry. So here we have, God knows what's going on in this first slide. I think that's a malignant blister that's being treated here of some sort, a bit of home nursing going on. And there's poor old Kate Winslet, nigh unto death as Marianne in that lovely film. Then as now, mothers were there to protect their children from danger, from their own rash behaviour, and also financially. We see Fanny Dashwood protecting her son's fortune, which is already large, in that famous scene in chapter 2 in Sense and Sensibility, in which the expectations of Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters get whistled away on the pretext that poor Harry might be left impoverished. In Persuasion, Anne's mother is dead, but Lady Russell, acting in loco parentis, counsels against the unwise match of heiress Anne with a penniless sailor. And what are Mrs. Bennet's machinations about? She's trying to assure the somewhat shaky financial security of her family. So we see a number of mothers acting to protect their children financially. But there are other forms of protection a mother might exert. Mrs. Dashwood does not fulfil her guardian role in protecting her children, specifically Marianne, from their own rash behaviour. During Marianne and Willoughby's courtship, there's a lot of eyebrow-raising behaviour. Eleanor expresses concern, but Mrs. Dashwood does not intervene, and later refuses to establish whether they are engaged because of romantic delicacy. Can anyone in this room imagine Mrs. Bennet suffering from romantic delicacy? And of course, a mother's role involves allowing her adult children independence, something Mrs. Ferrars fails to do, controlling her adult children with her money. Mrs. Morland, in contrast, sends her older children off into the world, believing and trusting that she's equipped them to cope. However, the major theme of Jane Austen's novels is marriage, and I make no apology for showing you all these lovely, lovely pictures of people getting this. Alan Rickman in his regimentals. I could come over all Mrs. Bennet about Alan Rickman in regimentals. All these lovely weddings that we had at the end of films and TV series. It was a key role for mothers and was absolutely crucial to ensure the future security of financial security of daughters. I've already mentioned the acquisition of accomplishments, and the next stage is to ensure that your marriageable daughter comes out, formally or informally, and is seen at a range of events and meets suitable young men. Since girls may not go out unchaperoned, it usually falls to their mothers to accompany them in social situations. So we see Mrs. Bennet taking her daughters to assemblies and balls and giving them a bit too much of a shove, to be honest, in the direction of nice young men. Lady Bertram in Mansfield Park doesn't go out into public with her daughters. This is taken over by Mrs. Norris, with disastrous results. Mrs. Morland, with another 9 children to look after, outsources this role to family friends, the Allens, who are going to Bath, where Catherine will meet a wider range of young men than is possible at home in the country. Sometimes a bit of maternal manoeuvring has to take place. For a proposal to occur, the couple must find themselves alone together, and Mrs. Bennet is our champion in this regard. She manages to leave Elizabeth alone with Mr. Collins, and later, more happily, Jane with Mr. Bingley. Even Mrs. Dashwood is not immune to a bit of manoeuvring. She remains in a fairly intolerable situation, staying at Norwood with her ghastly daughter-in-law, because she's seen the attraction between Edward and Eleanor and wants to allow it to develop. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, as you might imagine, has it all sorted out, and none of this manoeuvring will be necessary. Her daughter Anne is to marry Mr. Darcy, as arranged between their respective mothers, the feelings of the individuals concerned being irrelevant to this plan. In the real world, this would actually be much more common than we see in the novels, and when you think about it, that marriage would have made sense. It preserves the fortunes of both young people who are related to each other, keeps it all in the family. So we've already seen some of the mothers in action, fulfilling, or not, the various roles that might be required for them. However, my title is The Good, the Bad and the Really Terrible, so let's get on. We'll start with good mothers. My first good mother is Mrs. Bennet. Yep, Mrs. Bennet. I put it to you that she is an exceedingly good mother, and I'll explain why in a moment. She's one of Jane Austen's finest creations, but in print, she's a lot more subtle than she is in the various adaptations. So here are some of the Mrs. Bennets. Mrs. Bennet, Alison Steadman. I know it's not fashionable to be critical of Colin Firth, Pride and Prejudice, but she's a bit of a pantomime dame, isn't she? Priscilla Morgan, it's kind of of its time. She's not bad. Brenda Blethyn, she's quite good at the stuff. I'm a harassed mother. She always seems to be terribly busy. And Mary Boland, I'm assuming she's the Laurence Olivier film one. Yeah, I don't remember enough about that, apart from the fact they're all running about Crinlands at least 50 years too early. There is another Mrs. Bennet on the block, and this is one of my favourites. Wilma the Guinea Pig. Wilma the Guinea Pig starred in A Guinea Pig, Pride and Prejudice, and I'm very fine Mrs. Bennet, she is too. I'm sure many of you received that from Christmas. If anybody's got a copy lying about at home, give it to us and we'll sell it in the bookstall, it'll be fine. So Mrs. Bennet has been married for 23 years and she's the mother of 5 daughters. Her father, captivated by youth and beauty and that appearance of good humour which youth and beauty generally gives, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. Respect, esteem and confidence had all vanished forever, and his views of domestic happiness were overthrown. Although it should be noted they continued to produce regular children together. Apart from her matrimonial plans, of which more later, she doesn't really fulfil a maternal role. Lady Catherine is shocked to discover there has been no governess, and hard to admit, she's probably right on this occasion. Mrs. Bennet is unlikely to be much of an educator. You can't imagine her getting her girls to slave over French verbs, as Mrs. Norland has done. The girls have basically educated themselves, both in information and behaviour, with varying results. These days we call it self-directed learning. Elizabeth and Jane have tried to moderate the behaviour of Kitty and Lydia, but their mother's indulgence makes this pointless. Mrs. Bennet is loud and indiscreet, a frequent embarrassment to Elizabeth in particular. More seriously, Mr. Darcy makes it plain in his infamous first proposal that her mother's behaviour is a major reservation and has also been a factor in his removal of Bingley from Jane. However, her business in life is to get her daughters married, and she starts on page 1 of Pride and Prejudice as soon as Bingley's arrival is known. You remember the conversation she has with her husband. You must know that I'm thinking of his marrying one of them. And while the famous opening line may be a truth universally acknowledged, in this book it's mainly acknowledged by Mrs. Bennet. For a woman described as being of mean understanding, she's an arch plotter in this regard. She refuses Jane the carriage, so she gets wet and has to stay at Netherfield. She spots Mr. Collins' matrimonial intentions right away and guides him away from Jane, who she thinks is about to marry Bingley, and manoeuvres to leave her daughters alone with suitors. So in what ways is she a good mother? Because she's dead right about getting her daughters married. In particular, getting one of them, anyone at all, doesn't matter, married off to Mr. Collins, that solves the entail problem at a stroke. What's Mr. Bennet's plan? Jane Austen herself knew what it was like to be a dependent, unmarried daughter living in genteel poverty. By the end of the book, Mrs. Bennet has achieved her ends, and her daughters will be okay. 2 of them are well married, one's married, and she was dead right about one good marriage throwing the girls in the way of rich men. So one imagines Kitty at least will be all right, and possibly Mary too. Surely either the Darcys or the Bingleys may have a dull, earnest curate who would fit the bill. Mrs. Bennet is one mother I always think gets a harder time than she deserves. She's trying her best for her daughters, and we should accord her grudging respect at the very least. I'm sorry to step on David Richardson's toes, but my review of Mrs. Bennet led me to take a long, hard look at Mr. Bennet. He's usually portrayed as an amiable old buffer, but I think he's got a lot to answer for. There's a very chilling phrase in Pride and Prejudice about Mr. Bennet's attitude to Mrs. Bennet. He exposes his wife to the contempt of her own children. That's a terrible thing when you think about it. What's his plan for his daughter's future prosperity and well-being? The only money they will have is their mother's, because although the family live in some style, he's made no additional financial provision despite knowing of the entail. It is explained by saying that he expected to have a son, thereby cutting off the entail and making everything all right. However, Lydia, their last child, is 15, and prior to that, children had arrived every year or so. You would think it would have occurred to him some time ago that their childbearing years were over. Mr. Bennet has had 10 years to get his act together and save something for his daughters, and typically Mrs. Bennet's extravagance gets the blame. I think many of us in this room have seen the play Pride and Prejudice, sort of, where Mr. Bennet is portrayed by an armchair. He's about that dynamic and somewhat less useful. So I hope I've persuaded you that Mrs. Bennet is a good mother, and if that's too much to ask, that at least she's your favourite Bennet parent. Mrs. Jennings, in Sense and Sensibility, is often portrayed on film as a fat, vulgar, interfering busybody. Here she is in action, telling Marianne she knows what she will be up to. However, if you examine her as a mother, she's one of the ones I quite like as my mum. She's had me well married, as she has done for Charlotte and Lady Middleton, and she'd be seeking husbands for any of my single friends, as she's doing for the Dashwood girls and also the Steeles. She's very kind, and she clearly keeps all sorts of tasty treats in her kitchen, should I be feeling a bit down. She's an expert granny, spending lots of time helping Charlotte with the new baby, and when Marianne becomes seriously ill at Cleveland, she stays instead of leaving with her grandchild to supply the place of her mother. She can be an astute judge of character. She's got a Fanny Dashwood sus straight away, and she's quite sharp and funny, but she completely misunderstands Colonel Brandon's tete-a-tete with Eleanor. He's discussing offering the living to Edward and Lucy, while Mrs. Jennings, ever alert to romance, is imagining a proposal. Mrs. Jennings illustrates Jane Austen's genius with character. At the beginning, we kind of dislike her, she's a bit interfering old so-and-so, but along with Eleanor, we come to realise her good qualities as the book progresses. So I give you Mrs. Jennings, another excellent mother. If you gain anyone familiar with the novels, that's all of this room and all people on Zoom, I'm assuming, a few minutes to come up with the best mother in Jane Austen, you'll get your translator. It would possibly be Mrs. Morland from Northanger Abbey. She's the mother of 10. She's described as a woman of useful plain sense and a good constitution. I think we know that already. With all those children, it would have to be. Her older children have to shift for themselves as she's busy with the little ones and with lying in. Although, as we've seen, she takes a significant role in their education. She's a pretty hands-off mother, which may be a good or a bad thing, depending on your point of view. She's happy for Catherine to go to Bath with the Allens, and subsequently happy to trust their judgment about Catherine going off with the Tilneys, whom she's never met and the Allens have only just met. Remember, Catherine is 17 and there's no adult lady in the household. Can you imagine sending a 17-year-old off to stay with an unknown man and his family now? Mrs. Morland's motherly advice is worth treasuring. On her daughter's departure to Bath, she advises wrapping up warm and keeping track of her money. Nothing about unsuitable men. Her only concern about Catherine's lone journey home is that she might have left something behind in the coach, and typically turns it into a positive by suggesting it was good that Catherine had to use her initiative. An astute and sensible parent, when Catherine arrives home, Mrs. Morland spots that something is up and advises tea in an early night, and then the next day a visit to the Allens to distract her. She allows 3 days of moping and then tells Catherine to get her act together and threatens an improving text. Fortunately, Catherine is saved from this by the unexpected arrival of Henry, and her mother immediately spots the change in her daughter and silences a younger child who's trying to stymie Henry's suggestion of a walk alone with Catherine. The small child wants to come along with mother. She subsequently turns a blind eye to correspondence when Henry and Catherine are unofficially engaged, i.e. before the general knows about it. I love this illustration. So here's Catherine, she's just been given a letter. Mr. and Mrs. Morland are studiously looking the other way. Don't know, no, what letter? I see no letter. Mrs. Morland is a busy wife and mother, and she's created a happy home for her children. And if her older two are a little naive when going out in the world initially, James manages to get himself engaged to Isabella Thorpe, she's equipped them with the sense to learn from their mistakes, which is all a mother in this situation can do. Mrs. Harville, in Persuasion, is a very minor character, but she has claims to be one of the best mothers in Jane Austen. She has several children and has created a happy home, despite the injury to her husband and restricted income. When Louisa is injured, she takes charge, giving up her own bed. An experienced nurse, with an equally experienced nursery maid, she leaves nothing for anyone to do, according to Charles. Mind you, the only other nurse around is Mary. So we'd all quite happily let Mrs. Harville take charge in any domestic crisis. So she fits into this category. I'm going to have a swig of water. It is water, not gin, I promise. And that's my roundup of good mothers. So we'll move on to the bad mothers. There's a bit more of a selection in this category. So let's start with Mrs. Dashwood from Sense and Sensibility. Everybody's looking a bit shocked in the room. Are they looking shocked in Zoom, Marlon? She's 40 at the start of the action and the mother of 3 daughters facing significantly reduced circumstances. An interesting thing about the mothers in Jane Austen are their ages. Mrs. Dashwood's the only one whose age we know, she's 40. But in TV and film adaptations, they're nearly always played by much older actresses. So this is Gemma Jones in the 1995 adaptation. So she's 54 at the time it was filmed. So she's a bit more the wrong side of 40, if that's not a bit ungallant. But of course, she's near the right age to be Emma Thompson's mother, because Emma Thompson was 35 when Sense and Sensibility came out. Mrs. Dashwood is kind-hearted. Everybody likes her. She's described as having captivating manners. Mrs. Dashwood has an independence of spirit. She'll only visit families she can walk to, so she doesn't need to borrow a carriage, and she rebukes Sir John when he jokes about her daughters catching husbands. It is not an employment to which they have been brought up. She's eternally optimistic. She thinks the best of Willoughby when he's broken up with Marianne and makes excuses for his behaviour. So we're all agreed she's delightful, but why is she a bad mother? Firstly, because she and Marianne encourage each other in excessive sensibility. Marianne does not need any encouragement in this regard. And that's initially seen at the beginning of the book when they're bereaved and the pair of them are just winding each other up. As already mentioned, she doesn't fulfil her guardian role in protecting Marianne from her own rash behaviour with Willoughby. On one occasion, he uses her first name in front of her mother, unremarked upon, and that would be a major faux pas. That would not normally occur unless a couple were officially engaged. Her eternal optimism leads her to be unrealistic and impractical. It's Eleanor who moderates her ambitions and makes the practical decisions at the beginning of the book about the move, such as the need to get rid of the carriage. On a lighter note, there's the running joke in Sense and Sensibility about the improvements to the cottage, which of course she'll never be able to afford. Towards the end of the book, she's undergone a bit of a change, acknowledging that she has been imprudent and unjust to Eleanor because she wasn't suffering openly, and that there was always something in Willoughby's eyes that she didn't like. That sort of well-meaning self-deception sums up Mrs. Dashwood perfectly. The next bad mother is Mary Musgrove, married to Charles, the mother of two sons, Charles and Walter. She's probably suffering from terminal boredom. I always feel a bit sorry for Mary. She's got nothing in common with her dull husband, whose only interest seems to be shooting things, and she's certainly not a natural mother. While well, happy, and properly attended to, she had great good humour and excellent spirits, but any indisposition sunk her completely. She had no resources for solitude, and inheriting a considerable share of the Elliot self-importance, was very prone to add to every other distress that of fancying herself neglected and ill-used. We've all days like that, though, haven't we? She's not good in a crisis, such as the falls of little Charles and Louisa, and she has hysterics on both occasions. After little Charles's accident, when he falls out of a tree, she talks herself into going out to the planned dinner. She gives all sorts of excuses. She doesn't have the nerves for the sick room, and without the feelings of a mother will be so much better. But really, she just wants the novelty of meeting Captain Wentworth. And she particularly can't bear the idea of her husband going out to enjoy himself without her. Similarly, after the accident at Lyme, Captain Wentworth thinks she'll be keen to get back to her children, but he's very much mistaken. She's having a lovely time, going for walks, using the library, bathing, going to church. It's not clear who's looking after her children all this time. Soon afterwards, she offers to come to Bath for 4 to 6 weeks, while in the very same letter, she's criticised Mrs. Harville for parting with her children for so long while she's nursing Louisa. Her next bad mother is Mrs. Gardiner. Another sharp intake of breath in the room. Surely not lovely, elegant Mrs. Gardiner from Pride and Prejudice, such a friend and advisor to Jane and Elizabeth Bennet. Mrs. Gardiner has 4 children, aged from 8 down, and we don't actually hear anything about them. She's much too busy enjoying herself with young women who are probably not too far in age from her. She's another character who's younger than we think. Jane says at one point she may have more children, so I'm guessing, going by the age of the eldest child, she's probably in her late 20s. She gives Jane and Elizabeth lots of wise counsel, and when Lydia is discovered in London, she fulfills a quasi-maternal role by repeatedly trying to talk to her about her behaviour, something her own mother signally fails to do. However, we don't see her spending much time with her own children. For instance, in the Christmas visit to Longbourn, those children are not mentioned at all. To the extent that, a bit like Mr. Darcy's swimming, I wondered if the Gardiner children had been invented by Andrew Davis and not Jane Austen. Have they been left at home at Christmas? They certainly get left behind with Jane when the Gardiners go off with Lizzie on holiday to Derbyshire. These children are not seen and not heard. Mrs. Gardiner may come into her own as a mother when they're a bit more grown up, but at the moment she's better as a wise counsellor to the young women than as a mother of small children. I include Lady Bertram from Mansfield Park against my better judgment, because Lady Bertram's actually a genius. To continue with reading the theme of reading novels from a particular viewpoint, you can do a lot worse than read Mansfield Park looking at Lady Bertram. She's always the light relief in a novel containing so much genuine suffering. She's very beautiful, and her first piece of cleverness was to marry very well, at least £3,000 more than she might have expected, according to the lawyer uncle. Lady Bertram does absolutely nothing, and she does it extremely well. She's a genius at making life comfortable for herself and ensuring that everyone else makes her their first consideration. The whole family collude to make her life easy. Nothing can take place unless her comfort and ease have been accounted for. When Fanny is invited out to dinner at the Grants, it is impossible for Lady Mansfield to be left alone for a couple of hours. Although in a great house like Mansfield, with its hordes of servants, and on this occasion the presence of Sir Thomas, she's hardly all alone. She never needs to raise her voice, and she's always attended to. She's abdicated her maternal responsibilities to Mrs. Norris, although that may be a wee bit of a chicken and egg situation. The early chapters of Mansfield Park are all about Sir Thomas and Mrs. Norris organising things. Lady Bertram is notable in her absence. She's paid no attention to the education of her daughters and doesn't go into public with them. Another role for Mrs. Norris, who facilitates and encourages the disastrous match between Maria and Mr. Rushworth. Lady Bertram isn't a bad person. She's kind to Fanny, and she finds that Fanny is more and more important to her. She's also an animal lover, which gets her more points from me. One of the most startling and dynamic things she does in the whole book is in the scene where Sir Thomas unexpectedly arrives home from his perilous voyage. She's so pleased to see him, she puts down her work and moves the dog so he can sit on the sofa beside her. By not one circle was he listened to with such unbroken, unalloyed enjoyment as by his wife, who was really extremely happy to see him, and whose feelings were so warmed by his sudden arrival as to place her nearer agitation than she has been for the last 20 years. She was almost fluttered for a few moments. That's Jane Austen's genius right there in a single word. She was almost fluttered for a few moments, and still remained so sensibly animated as to put away her work, move Pug from her side, and give all her attention and the rest of the sofa to her husband. So I give you Lady Bertram. She's a bad mother, but she's got it all worked out, and you have to admire her for it. Moving on to the really terrible mothers. What differentiates this lot from the merely bad is the impact they have on those around them. They really are a pretty ghastly bunch. Firstly, there's Mrs. Clay in Persuasion. Mrs. Clay has 2 children. Who knew? Where are they? She's off gallivanting with Miss Elliot and trying to catch the eye of the baronet. She's the one I did. Who else didn't know she was a mother? She's got 2 children. Or did anyone else know that? Mrs. Ferrars in Sense and Sensibility. She is the wealthy widowed mother of Edward, Fanny, and Robert. She doesn't appear in person until well over halfway through the book, but we hear a lot about her. She uses her money to control her adult children. In fact, Fanny is well married, so she's not as financially dependent on her mother's whim, and she's most like her mother at any rate. She keeps Edward dependent as no suitable career has been found for him. Jane Austen has lots of fun with the ever more convoluted financial arrangements she makes to try and keep her sons in line. Towards the end of the book, pardon me, her fortune keeps switching destinations. I'll drink the water. Her children are all damaged, to use a modern vernacular. And that's going to tip over a picture there. Fanny's unpleasant. Edward's too afraid to stand up to her, and Robert, her favourite, is a dilettante. Most people are afraid of her. Lucy is, correctly as it turns out, nervous about her knowing of the engagement. John Dashwood is frightened when Marianne angers her. Remember, she's defending Eleanor's paints, her painted screens. And Fanny and John conceal the news about Edward's living for fear of her reaction. She wouldn't be able to bear hearing good news about her cast-off son. She's one scary woman, and unlike Mrs. Morland, incapable of allowing her children any independence. Mrs. Price in Mansfield Park has married beneath herself. She's the mother of 9 living children. She's fond of her sons, but not her daughters, except Betsy, the youngest, who's a spoiled brat. She's a terrible housekeeper and a mother who can't manage her servants or her children. She has to ask her wealthy relatives for assistance and is surprised when they offer to take a daughter, not a son. Once Fanny has arrived at Mansfield, she doesn't hear from her mother. She gets her news of home from William. Nobody, including her mother, seems to think that Fanny might like a visit home, until years later when she's sent as some sort of punishment for failing to accept Henry Crawford. On their arrival, the house is in uproar and she hasn't arranged a meal for William and Fanny. She's not interested in Fanny or her life and fails to notice how miserable she is during her visit. Fanny sees her clearly for what she is, a dawdle and a slattern. So it's Fanny that said that. Fancy Timothy Fanny thinking a thing like that. I've saved my best for last. Lady Catherine de Bourgh. You kind of have to say it like that. You can't just go Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And does anyone else think Dame Judy's far too nice a person to be playing the god-awful Lady Catherine? Anyway, she is the widowed mother of one, Anne. And she's another one, we hear an awful lot about her before we meet her, mainly from Mr. Collins, who thinks the sun, well, I don't see where he thinks the sun shines from, but also from Wickham. Lizzie and Wickham discuss her before Elizabeth has ever met her, and Elizabeth declares she must be arrogant and conceited. So that's Elizabeth being prejudiced again, although in fact she's right on this occasion. She's an opinionated woman who's not used to being contradicted. She micromanages all poor Charlotte's concerns, and is a frequent caller at the parsonage to interfere. So poor old Charlotte doesn't just have to put up with her god-awful husband, she's got the god-awful Lady Catherine as a neighbour. Actually, Lady Catherine does that to the whole parish. Her invitations seem to very much depend on who's around. The invitations to Hunsford Parsonage tail off when Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam are staying with her, and they resume when they leave. She's breathtakingly rude, particularly to Elizabeth and Mrs. Bennet when she turns up at the end of the book. She barely acknowledges her hostess, she's rude about the sitting room, and unbidden looks into other rooms. That would be rude even now, wouldn't it? As I've already let slip, Mrs. Bennet is rather a favourite of mine, and her immaculate manners in the face of this terrible rudeness are another point in her favour. Lady Catherine's daughter little resembles her. She's said to be sickly, but has probably had all life and spirit crushed out of her by her overbearing mother. She does very little, she expresses no opinions of her own, and has no reported direct speech. Poor Anne de Bourgh. So I picked out some of the mothers in Jane Austen, but I had to leave out a few of my favourites. For instance, Lady Lucas. Next time you're reading Pride and Prejudice, look out for Lady Lucas. There's only a few paragraphs about her in Pride and Prejudice, but they're all funny and they capture her perfectly. I'm also fond of Emma's sister, Isabella Knightley, and Mrs. Musgrove Senior in Persuasion, but you have to stop somewhere. So who do I think is the best mother in Jane Austen and who's the worst? And if I know anything about this audience, they're going to have opinions and something to say about it all, so you'll get your chance to ever see. So here's my nominations for the best mother, and they are Mrs. Bennet, Mrs. Jennings, Mrs. Harville, and Mrs. Morland. And my nominations for the worst are Mrs. Ferrers, Mrs. Price, Lady Catherine, and Mrs. Clay. So I'm going to throw it open to the floor. Now's your chance to nominate somebody else in either category, or speak on behalf of your favourite or the one that you love to hate. And in a few minutes we'll have a show of hands, so we're going to have an official best and worst mother. And obviously if you want to ask me any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary. That was excellent as always. Very entertaining.
We're not done yet.
Just before we go on to the vote, I wanted to ask you, some of us last night were at the Carnegie Hall and we saw Rebecca Vaughan portraying Lady Susan
Yes.
and various other characters in the
Yes,
story as well. She was excellent. I really enjoyed it. You didn't say very much about Lady Susan.
No, I
I'm
deliberately
sure
missed her out.
most of us would agree that she's not a very good mother. Do you have any other comments on Lady Susan for us?
No, she's another one that's a bit of a genius, isn't she, though? She always works it out best for herself, and her poor daughter is, you know, she's a chattel, really. You do wonder, you know, the Jane Austen's novels, although they create a very real world for us, they're a bit of a fantasy. So what I said about Lady Catherine and Darcy's mother planning the marriage, that's probably much more realistic. And having an ungrateful daughter that won't do what she's told, you know, again, you know, at the time, I'm wondering if Lady Susan, some of her, you know, contemporary English readers were going, well, that's absolutely fine. But yeah, she is a pretty ghastly woman, but she works everything all out very nicely for herself, doesn't she?
Very selfish in a way, but I do feel sorry for her poor daughter who doesn't really have much of a chance. Surprisingly, it ends up reasonably well.
Yes. Jane Austen sprinkles her magic fairy dust at the end.
It was quite lucky. Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask Hilary? Because that was really interesting, and I think she's covered a great deal for us in that. Elspeth?
It was rather nice to hear somebody defending Mrs. Bennet.
Oh, yes.
Because she's so often portrayed as stupid and snobbish and silly. But when you think about it, Mr. Bennet did not fulfill his obligations to his family. She was trying to do her best. She might not have done it in what we might consider the best way.
Yes, on the most tactful way.
But you could see that there was desperation, I've got to find, because
Yeah.
we see from Charlotte, what happens if you don't?
Yes,
If you're not able to marry well.
yes, I'm sympathetic to Charlotte as well. You know, Charlotte took a good look around her and went, "He'll do." I think there's been a bit of a revision about Mrs. Bennet recently. I've heard more opinions expressed that Mrs. Bennet actually was doing her best, as you see.
And
Something.
if you just looked at the adaptations, then
Yes.
you would think, oh, Mrs. Bennet's terrible.
Uh-huh.
But you're right that there's so much more detail in the text that makes you look closer at the two parents. And
Yes,
I think you're right. I think her silliness is emphasised more, isn't it, in the
Yeah.
production
Yes.
rather than.
For comic effects usually.
Yes,
but
yes,
yeah,
of course.
I mean, she is a great comic character, but
Yes.
yeah, there's that back. Maybe that's what makes her a great character. Is there's that background,
Yes.
not a sadness, that's not the word, but there's a seriousness of purpose to